The little black girl warned the biker someone dragged a child into a restricted chamber under the science tower. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. The sun was setting as the carnival lights began to flicker to life in the distance. It was the kind of evening that promised laughter, excitement, and fun. Families gathered, children ran around, and the smell of kettle corn mixed with the faint scent of motor oil. But amid all this joy, there was a small figure in the crowd, her face streaked with tears, her eyes wide with panic. A little black girl, no older than 8 or 9, was rushing toward the biker's booth at the carnival, her voice trembling as she screamed for help. "Please, someone took my brother," she cried, her breath short, her chest heaving with fear. She was out of breath and desperate, stumbling toward a group of tough-looking bikers who were setting up at the booth. They were part of a local motorcycle club known for their rough past, but their deep sense of loyalty and honor now. The leader of the group, a man named Jake, looked up, his hand instinctively reaching for his jacket, recognizing the seriousness in the girl's eyes. "What happened?" Jake asked, kneeling down to her level, his voice calm, but sharp with concern. The little girl could hardly get the words out through her sobs. "They dragged him into the building," she managed to say, pointing toward the tall, imposing science tower in the distance. The big building with the red lights. Her voice faltered, but she looked up at Jake with wide eyes that begged for help. The bikers exchanged uneasy glances. They had heard rumors about the science tower, about the restricted chambers that no one was allowed to enter. There were stories, whispers of strange experiments, and things that went on behind those locked doors. Jake's eyes narrowed as he turned toward his crew. This wasn't just a petty squabble or a local dispute. This was something bigger, something darker. He placed a hand on the girl's shoulder, offering what little comfort he could. "Stay with us. We'll find him. We won't let anyone hurt him." The bikers quickly huddled together, their conversation hushed. They had their code, and this wasn't a situation they could walk away from. "All right, we're going in," Jake said, his voice low but filled with authority. "Gear up. We don't know what we're walking into, but we'll make sure she's safe and that kid gets out of there." As the group prepared, the girl looked up at Jake, her eyes full of fear, but also a small glimmer of hope. She didn't know who these bikers were, but she could feel the sincerity in their promise. For the first time that night, she allowed herself to breathe a little easier. The bikers mounted their motorcycles, the engines roaring to life as they revved through the carnival parking lot. Their plan was simple: head to the tower, get inside, and find the boy before it was too late. The girl led the way, her tiny hand clutching Jake's arm, guiding them toward the looming structure ahead. She didn't know what was waiting for them, but she knew one thing for sure: these bikers were her last hope. The group of bikers sped through the darkened streets, the hum of their engines slicing through the still night air. The small girl, clutching Jake's arm tightly, led the way as they neared the towering structure. The science tower loomed ahead, its glass windows reflecting the dim streetlights below. The once lively carnival was now a distant memory, swallowed by the eerie silence of the streets. The girl's voice, barely audible over the sound of the roaring motorcycles, trembled as she spoke. "It's just ahead. We're almost there." Jake nodded, his eyes scanning the building, his mind racing with thoughts of what they might find inside. The rumors about the tower had been circulating for years, stories of secretive experiments, missing people, and strange occurrences. But nothing could prepare them for the danger that lay behind those walls. "We need to stay sharp," Jake called out, his voice cutting through the noise. "Stick to the plan. No one goes in alone." The group rode up to the entrance, a large, imposing metal door with a rusted sign that read, "Authorized personnel only." It was a standard warning, but something about this place felt different, like the danger wasn't just within the walls. It was embedded in the very air they were breathing. The bikers dismounted quickly, each one pulling out their equipment. Jake took the lead, motioning for the others to follow. The little girl stayed close to him, her wide eyes constantly darting around, as if she could feel the danger lurking just out of sight. "This way," she whispered, pointing toward a side entrance hidden in the shadows. The group moved swiftly, the sound of boots hitting the concrete mixing with the soft shuffle of the girl's feet as she guided them toward the back of the building. They reached the door, which was surprisingly unlocked. A soft creak echoed in the stillness as Jake turned the handle, pushing the door open just enough to slip inside. The room beyond was dimly lit, filled with the smell of dust and something else, something metallic, like the scent of old machinery. The floor creaked underfoot as the bikers moved cautiously forward, their senses heightened. Jake's heart pounded in his chest as he looked around. The room appeared to be some sort of storage area, filled with old equipment and boxes that hadn't been touched in years. But there was something unsettling about the stillness, like they weren't supposed to be there. "Where do we go from here?" One of the bikers, Diesel, whispered. The girl turned to him, her face pale with fear. "Downstairs," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "There's a basement. That's where they took him." Jake nodded and motioned for the group to follow. They moved toward a set of stairs at the far end of the room, the air growing colder with every step. The stairs creaked under their weight as they descended into the darkness. The basement was even colder, the air thick with the scent of something foul, like old chemicals. There was a dim light at the far end of the room, flickering intermittently. The bikers paused at the bottom of the stairs, their eyes adjusting to the dim light. What they saw made their blood run cold. In the center of the room, shackled to a metal chair, was a young boy, no older than 10. His face was bruised, his clothes torn. His eyes were wide with fear, but he didn't speak, as if he was too terrified to even move. The sight of him sent a chill through the group. "Is that him?" Jake asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The little girl nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "That's Jamal." Jake stepped forward, his heart heavy with determination. "We're getting him out of here," he said firmly. The bikers moved quickly, securing the area. One of them, Phantom, moved toward the boy, carefully unshackling him. But as he did, there was a sudden noise, footsteps approaching. The group froze, their instincts kicking in. "Get ready," Jake whispered. "We've got company." The sound of footsteps grew louder, and Jake could see shadows moving in the hallway beyond. The danger was closing in. But they had no choice now. They had come too far to back down. "Stay close," Jake ordered. "We move fast, and we don't stop until we're out of here." Just as the first figure appeared in the doorway, Jake gave the signal, and the bikers rushed forward, grabbing the boy and making their way toward the exit. The hallway was narrow, and the flickering light above them cast long, eerie shadows on the walls. The sound of boots pounding against the concrete echoed in the stillness as they rushed to the door. But just as they reached the exit, a voice shouted from behind them, "Stop." It was too late. The bikers had already made their move. The door slammed shut behind them as they rushed toward the motorcycles. But the danger wasn't over yet. The shadows in the distance were closing in fast, and they needed to get out, now. The door slammed shut behind them, the sound of metal striking metal echoing down the dim hallway. Jake's heart was pounding in his chest as he grabbed the boy, Jamal, by the shoulders and pushed him forward. "Move," he shouted, his voice harsh, urgent. The rest of the bikers quickly followed suit, rushing toward the exit, but they knew they weren't out of the woods yet. The sound of footsteps grew louder, and Jake could hear shouting in the distance. The enemy was closing in fast. They had no time to waste. As they reached the door, Diesel, the largest of the group, took the lead. "I've got it," he growled, swinging open the heavy metal door and leading the way into the night. The group spilled out into the parking lot, the cool night air biting at their skin. But there was no time to catch their breath. Jake could already hear the engines of the cars following them, the screeching of tires as they skidded around the corner. They had to go. "Now, get on the bikes," Jake ordered, his voice sharp. The bikers didn't hesitate. They moved quickly, each one mounting their motorcycle and revving the engines. The sound of the engines roaring to life was like a signal, a reminder that they weren't backing down. "Where's the girl?" Jake called, looking around. The little girl, Aisha, was standing by his side, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear. She looked up at him, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm here," she said, her hand reaching for Jake's. "We're getting out of here," he reassured her, pulling her gently onto his bike. "Hold on tight." The group sped out of the parking lot, racing down the dark road. Behind them, The sound of the pursuing vehicles was growing louder. The enemy wasn't far behind, but the bikers weren't going to make it easy for them. As they roared through the streets, the headlights of the cars began to close in, but Jake was ready. "Get ready for a fight," he shouted to his crew. He could feel the adrenaline coursing through his veins as he looked back over his shoulder. The pursuers were relentless, but the bikers weren't going to let them catch up. They turned sharply down a side street, the motorcycles skidding as they took the sharp corner. The sound of screeching tires followed them, but they kept pushing forward, the engines screaming as they raced down the narrow alleyways. "We need to get to the highway," Jake shouted, his eyes scanning the road ahead. They needed a way out, a clear path. The tension in the air was thick, and the weight of the situation was beginning to hit him. A little boy had been kidnapped, and now they were in the middle of a high-speed chase with unknown enemies who wouldn't stop until they had what they wanted. But Jake wasn't about to let that happen. He wasn't going to lose another kid. They raced toward the highway, the lights of the city fading behind them as the darkness swallowed them whole. The sound of the tires on the road was all they could hear as they picked up speed. The enemy cars were closing in again, but the bikers weren't slowing down. They were a team, united and determined, ready to fight for the life of an innocent child. Jake could see the lights of the highway in the distance, a beacon of safety. They were almost there. But as they approached the exit ramp, something happened that made his blood run cold. A set of flashing red and blue lights appeared in the rearview mirror. "The cops!" someone shouted. "Damn it!" Jake cursed under his breath. They couldn't afford to be stopped now. The stakes were too high. "We don't have time for this," he muttered. The bikers didn't flinch. They sped up, pushing their motorcycles to their limits, weaving through traffic to escape the police pursuit. They couldn't risk getting caught, not when Jamal's life was on the line. They raced down the ramp and onto the highway, the sound of sirens growing distant. But Jake knew they weren't out of danger yet. The police were one problem, but the real threat was still behind them. He glanced over at Aisha, her face pressed against his back, her small hands gripping him tightly. He wished he could promise her that everything would be okay, but he couldn't. Not yet. They needed to get away, and fast. "Hold on," Jake shouted, leaning forward on the bike. The others followed suit, the motorcycles roaring as they surged ahead, cutting through the night like a storm. But the road ahead was dark, and they had no idea what they were heading into. "We're almost there," Jake yelled, his voice full of urgency. The highway stretched out before them, endless and unforgiving. But as they sped down the road, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that something, was waiting for them at the end of this chase. The enemy was relentless, and they wouldn't stop until they had the boy. Jake wasn't going to let that happen. Not on his watch. The motorcycles roared down the highway, cutting through the night like a wave of thunder. The cold wind bit at their faces as they pushed forward, the dim lights of the city far behind them. Jake's hands were gripping the handlebars tightly, his eyes fixed on the road ahead, but his mind was racing. He could hear the sound of the police, sirens in the distance, but he didn't dare look back. The pursuit was relentless, and time was running out. Aisha, the little girl, was holding on to him, her small arms wrapped tightly around his waist, her body pressed against his back. Jake could feel her fear, her body trembling with every bump in the road. He wanted to promise her that everything would be okay, but he knew they were far from out of danger. The enemy wasn't just the cops chasing them. It was the men who had taken Jamal, and they wouldn't stop until they got him back. The sound of the sirens grew louder, and Jake knew that they were getting closer to the highway exit. He glanced over at the others, their bikes weaving through the traffic, pushing forward with a determination that matched his own. The pursuit was closing in. They couldn't afford to slow down now. He glanced at Aisha again, her wide eyes staring ahead, her face pale, but her grip on him tightening. He could feel her trust in him, and he couldn't fail her. "Hold on tight," Jake said through clenched teeth. The others were already pulling ahead, their bikes cutting through the traffic with expert precision. Diesel, the largest of the group, was leading the pack, his massive frame cutting a path through the chaos. Jake knew Diesel was the right person for the job. Nothing could stop him once he had a target in his sights. As they reached the exit ramp, Jake pushed his bike forward, cutting through the sharp turn with ease. The others followed in formation, moving like a well-oiled machine. The bikes were a blur as they raced down the ramp, leaving the traffic and police behind. For a moment, it felt like they had gained some ground, But Jake knew better. The enemy was close, and they wouldn't give up easily. "We've got to make it to the safe house," Jake muttered under his breath. They couldn't risk stopping in the open. They needed to regroup, to plan their next move. The bikes roared as they sped through the dark streets, the sound echoing through the empty night. They were almost there, just a few more miles. But as they rounded another corner, Jake saw headlights in the distance, 2 cars speeding toward them. "Damn it," Jake cursed, his heart racing. The cars were blocking their path, and they weren't going to let them pass easily. "Get ready," Jake shouted to the group, his voice filled with urgency. The bikers immediately began to adjust, positioning themselves to outmaneuver the cars. They weren't going to let the enemy get the upper hand. The headlights grew brighter as the cars sped toward them, the sound of the engines roaring in the night. The enemy was closing in fast, but Jake wasn't going to give up. He couldn't afford to. The bikes shot forward, weaving through the traffic with skill and precision. Diesel, in the lead, took a sharp turn to the left, forcing the first car to slow down. The rest of the group followed suit, splitting off in different directions, making it harder for the enemy to keep up. The bikes were quick, but the cars had more power. Jake knew they couldn't outrun them forever. "We need to get to the bridge," Jake said, his voice steady but urgent. The bridge was their only chance to make it out. Once they were on it, they could cut off the road, escape the pursuit, and regroup. The others nodded, and they made their way toward the bridge, pushing their bikes to the limit. The cars were still behind them, but Jake could hear the engines fading as they reached the ramp. The bikers turned sharply, heading toward the bridge. They were almost there. But as they reached the edge of the bridge, something unexpected happened. A car swerved in front of them, blocking their path. Jake slammed on the brakes, barely avoiding a collision. The others followed suit, but they were trapped. The enemy had cut off their escape. "Move now," Jake shouted, his voice filled with rage. The bikers immediately turned their bikes around, speeding in the opposite direction. The cars were still behind them, but now they were fighting for their lives. The bridge was their only hope. Jake's heart pounded in his chest as he pushed his bike forward, weaving through the traffic with expert precision. He could see the others ahead of him, their bikes moving like a blur, pushing forward. But the enemy wasn't giving up. The chase was far from over. And Jake could feel the weight of every second as they raced down the bridge. His heart was pounding in his chest, the sound of the motorcycle's engines thundering in the night air, mixing with the shrill scream of the sirens behind them. The cars were relentless, their headlights blinding in the rearview mirror. Every move they made felt like it could be their last. The enemy was closing in, but the bikers weren't backing down. "Keep pushing," Jake shouted over his shoulder to the rest of the group. "We've got to make it to the exit." The group, moving like a well-oiled machine, responded without hesitation. Diesel, as always, led the charge, his massive frame cutting through the wind like a freight train. The rest of the bikers followed suit, weaving in and out of traffic, staying just a few steps ahead of the pursuit. But the gap was closing, and Jake knew that they couldn't keep this up for long. The bridge stretched out before them, the lights of the city now far behind, but the road ahead seemed endless, as if it was taunting them. He could feel the adrenaline surging through him, but he wasn't going to let it cloud his judgment. This was about more than just escaping. It was about getting Jamal to safety. They needed to stay focused. As they reached the end of the bridge, Jake saw the exit in the distance. It was their only chance. The bikers gunned their engines, pushing their bikes harder, faster, with everything they had left. But just as they neared the ramp, the sound of a car screeching to a halt cut through the air. A black SUV had pulled up ahead, blocking their path. Jake's heart skipped a beat. They were trapped. The car doors slammed open, and 2 men stepped out, their faces hidden by dark masks. Jake's instincts kicked in, and he immediately signaled for the group to spread out. The bikers knew what to do. They couldn't afford to stop now, but they had to be ready for whatever was coming. The men in the SUV weren't just trying to stop them, they were trying to take Jamal back. Jake's hands tightened around the handlebars as he steered his bike toward the nearest lane, making sure to keep Jamal protected. The rest of the group followed suit, fanning out and ready to face the men. "Stay close, and don't let them get to him," Jake barked. The tension in the air was palpable. The bikers were ready for a fight, but they couldn't let it turn into a full-blown battle, not with Jamal in the middle of it all. As the 2 men began to move toward them, one of the bikers, Wrench, pulled out his phone, and quickly dialed. "I'm getting backup," he said, his voice calm but urgent. Jake nodded. They needed all the help they could get. The men in the SUV advanced, their steps quick and determined. The first one reached for Jamal, but Jake was faster. In a split second, he maneuvered his bike between the man and the boy, blocking his path. "Not today," Jake muttered under his breath. The man paused for a moment, sizing up Jake, but he didn't back down. Instead, he reached for the gun at his waist. "We don't want to do this," Jake said, his voice low but firm. "Just let the kid go, and we'll be on our way." The man scoffed, his grip tightening on the weapon. "You're too late," he growled. "The kid's ours." Jake's mind raced. He couldn't let this escalate. He couldn't afford to make a mistake. He glanced at Diesel, who was already positioning himself to block the other man. "Get ready," Jake shouted. In an instant, the first man lunged at him, but Jake was already moving. He swerved to the side, narrowly avoiding the man's grasp, and with one swift motion, he knocked the man off balance, sending him sprawling to the ground. The second man, seeing his partner go down, lunged forward, but Diesel was right behind him. The two men collided with a force that rattled the ground beneath them. Jake quickly checked on Jamal, making sure the boy was safe. "Stay down," he whispered to him. Jamal nodded, his eyes wide with fear, but he remained hidden behind the bikes, knowing that his safety depended on the bikers. The situation was getting out of hand. More cars were approaching, and they didn't have much time. "We need to move," Jake said, his voice sharp. Now, the bikers were already revving their engines, ready to take off at a moment's notice. Diesel, having dealt with the second man, quickly jumped back onto his bike, and the group began to pull away, heading down the exit ramp toward the highway. But just as they made the turn, Jake felt a sharp pain in his side. He glanced down to see blood seeping through his jacket. The man he had knocked down had managed to get a shot off, grazing his side. Jake gritted his teeth, the pain searing through him, but he couldn't let it stop him. They had to get to safety. "Everyone stay sharp," Jake shouted, forcing himself to focus. The group sped down the highway, weaving through the traffic, and the sound of the police sirens grew distant. But Jake knew they weren't safe yet. The chase had only just begun. The sound of their roaring engines filled the night as the group of bikers tore down the highway, the flickering city lights now a distant memory. Jake's side throbbed with pain, but he pushed it aside. The sharp sting was a constant reminder that they weren't out of danger yet. The group had just barely managed to escape the clutches of the men in the black SUV, but the chase was far from over. The police were still on their tail, and they had no choice but to keep moving. "We need to lose them," Jake said, his voice strained but focused. Diesel, the largest biker in the group, looked back at him with a grim expression. "No way we're outrunning them with these bikes," he muttered. Jake's eyes scanned the road ahead. He needed a plan, and fast. They couldn't keep this up forever. They had to find a way to get Jamal to safety. "There's an old warehouse off Route 63, Jake said, his voice steady despite the pain. "We can lose them there." Diesel nodded, his expression hardening with determination. "Lead the way." Jake quickly turned the handlebars, steering his bike toward the exit ramp. The others followed closely behind, weaving through the traffic, trying to put as much distance as possible between them and the police. But the sirens were getting closer. They couldn't risk getting caught. They had to act fast. As they approached the turn onto Route 63, Jake heard the sound of the police cars gaining on them. The flashing lights in his rearview mirror were becoming a constant reminder that time was running out. "Almost there," Jake muttered under his breath. But just as they rounded the corner, another black SUV appeared in the distance, its headlights cutting through the darkness. It was the same car from earlier, the men who had tried to take Jamal. Jake's stomach sank. "They found us again," he said, his voice tight with frustration. The group quickly accelerated, pushing their bikes faster, but the SUV was closing in. The men weren't going to let them go without a fight. "They're not giving up," Diesel growled. "We can't outrun them." Jake's heart raced as he glanced ahead. The old warehouse was just up ahead, but it was still too far. He could feel the heat of the pursuing car behind them, closing in like a predator about to strike. "Get ready," Jake said. "We're going to have to fight." The bikers didn't hesitate. They had faced danger before, but this was different. This wasn't just about them. It was about protecting an innocent child. As the SUV closed in, Jake glanced over at Aisha, who was still clinging to him. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear, but there was a glimmer of trust in them. She was counting on them. The biker in the lead position, Diesel, was the first to act. With a loud roar, he swerved his bike sharply, cutting in front of the SUV, blocking its path. The driver slammed on the brakes, trying to avoid the collision, but it was too late. The SUV skidded, its tires screeching as it lost control. The bikers seized the opportunity and surged forward, their bikes roaring as they sped toward the warehouse. The car behind them swerved, trying to catch up, but it was too late. The entrance to the warehouse was just ahead. With a final push, the bikers rushed inside, the sound of their engines echoing off the walls as they sped into the dark interior. The moment they entered, the doors slammed shut behind them, cutting off the pursuit. But they weren't safe yet. Jake could hear the sound of footsteps approaching. They had no time to rest. "Stay sharp," Jake ordered, his voice cold and steady. The bikers dismounted quickly, scanning the area for any threats. The warehouse was dark and abandoned, filled with old crates and broken machinery. But the atmosphere was tense, as if danger was lurking around every corner. Jake motioned for the others to follow him as he led the group further into the warehouse. They needed to regroup, plan their next move. The lights from the police cars flickered through the windows, but for now, they were safe. "We need to stay here for a while," Jake said, his voice low. "We'll make sure we're not followed, then figure out how to get Jamal to safety." The bikers nodded, setting up a perimeter around the warehouse. Diesel kept an eye on the door while the others checked the windows. Jake walked over to Aisha, who was still standing by his side. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with worry. "Is he going to be okay?" she asked quietly, her voice trembling. Jake looked down at her, his expression softening. "We'll make sure he is. We won't stop until he's safe." Aisha nodded, her small hands gripping Jake's jacket tightly. She trusted him, and that trust was the only thing that kept her going. The sound of the engines had faded into the distance, but Jake knew that the danger wasn't over. They couldn't stay here for long. They needed to move, and fast. "We've got to be ready," Jake said, turning back to the group. "This isn't over." The bikers continued to keep watch as Jake began to make plans. They had no choice but to keep pushing forward, one step at a time, until they could get Jamal to safety and put an end to this nightmare. The minutes dragged on as the bikers settled into the abandoned warehouse, their bikes parked in a tight formation near the back door. Jake's side still throbbed with pain, the blood from his wound now slowing to a trickle, but he couldn't afford to dwell on it. He had to keep his focus on Jamal and the mission ahead. The group remained alert, scanning every corner of the dark, dilapidated space for any sign of danger. Diesel stood guard by the door, his massive frame blocking the only entrance, while the others moved silently, checking the windows and securing the perimeter. The faint sound of police sirens could still be heard in the distance, but for now, they were safe. Or so it seemed. Jake walked over to the corner where Jamal sat, his eyes wide with fear. The boy had been through too much, and it showed in his trembling hands and bruised face. Aisha, standing close by, kept her hand on Jamal's shoulder, offering him what little comfort she could. "Are you all right?" Jake asked softly, crouching down in front of the boy. Jamal nodded, but the fear in his eyes was undeniable. "I'm scared," Jamal whispered. Jake's heart ached at the sound of the boy's voice. He couldn't imagine what Jamal had been through, what he'd seen. But Jake knew that if they didn't act quickly, things could get worse. "You're safe now," Jake said, trying to reassure him. "We won't let anything happen to you." Aisha looked at Jake, her eyes full of gratitude and trust. She had put her faith in these bikers, and so far, they hadn't let her down. But there was a heavy weight in the air, an unspoken understanding that their fight was far from over. They had gotten this far, but the enemy wasn't done. Jake turned to his crew, his voice low and urgent. "We need to move. The longer we stay here, the more chance they have of finding us." Diesel stepped forward, his brow furrowed. "What's the plan?" Jake took a deep breath. "We head north. There's a safe house we can reach before morning. We'll regroup there and figure out our next move." Wrench, one of the younger bikers, spoke up. "We can't just leave the warehouse like this. We need to make sure no one's following us." Jake nodded. "Agreed. But we have to stay one step ahead. We can't afford to take any chances." The group quickly began to prepare. They gathered their gear, checked their weapons, and made sure their bikes were in working order. As they moved to the back of the warehouse to load up, a sudden noise echoed from the front. A loud crash. "They're here," Diesel shouted, his voice filled with urgency. The sound of boots pounding on the concrete floor reached them, followed by shouts from the men who had been chasing them. The enemy was closing in fast. "It's too late to leave the way we came," Jake muttered, his mind racing. "We need to take another route." The bikers quickly formed a plan, moving with practiced efficiency. They couldn't let the enemy catch up now, not after everything they had been through. Jake motioned for Diesel to take point, leading the way as they moved toward the back exit. The rest of the group followed closely, keeping to the shadows as they made their way out of the warehouse. The cold night air hit them as they stepped outside, the sound of the men's voices growing louder behind them. The group moved quickly, their footsteps light and fast. They had to reach the bikes without being seen. Just as they reached the back alley, a car screeched to a halt, its headlights blinding them. The men were closer than they thought. "Move," Jake shouted, pushing Aisha and Jamal forward. "Get to the bikes now." The group sprinted toward their motorcycles, the sound of the car's engine growling as it revved in pursuit. The men weren't going to let them escape without a fight. "They're coming," Wrench yelled as he reached his bike. The bikers mounted their motorcycles in a rush, revving the engines and speeding off into the night. The sound of the pursuing car's engine was drowned out by the roar of their bikes as they tore down the street, heading toward the north exit. Jake's heart raced as he glanced over his shoulder, watching the headlights of the car fade into the distance. They were gaining ground, but they still had a head start. For now, they were free. But Jake knew this was just the beginning. The road ahead was uncertain, and they had no idea what awaited them at the safe house. All they could do was keep moving, stay together, and fight for their survival. As they made their way down the empty highway, the danger felt closer than ever. They were being hunted, but they weren't going down without a fight. Jake's grip tightened on the handlebars as he pushed his bike faster, the wind whipping past his face. He had made a promise to Aisha, to Jamal, and he wasn't going to let them down. The group sped forward, their headlights cutting through the darkness as they disappeared into the night. The wind howled as the group of bikers continued to speed down the deserted highway, their engines roaring like thunder in the quiet night. The lights of the city were now behind them, and the landscape ahead was dark, stretching out into the unknown. Jake's hand gripped the throttle tightly, his mind focused despite the pain still searing in his side. He didn't have time to dwell on it. Not when Jamal's safety, and Aisha's, depended on him. The police sirens had faded, but Jake knew it was only a matter of time before the enemy found them again. They were being hunted, and they couldn't afford to stop. The group had taken a winding route north, leaving behind the chaos of the city. But the farther they traveled, the more Jake felt the weight of the situation. The air was colder now, the darkness more oppressive. The headlights of their bikes were the only source of light, casting long shadows on the empty road ahead. They were heading for a safe house, a place Jake had used before. It was isolated, secure, and far off the beaten path. But the closer they got to it, the more anxious Jake became. They were almost there, but every mile seemed to bring a new wave of uncertainty. Aisha was still clinging to him, her small hands gripping his jacket as if it was the only thing holding her together. Jamal, riding behind him, was quiet, his face pale, his eyes scanning the road ahead. He was still processing everything that had happened, but Jake could tell the boy was terrified. "Are you okay back there?" Jake asked, glancing over his shoulder. Jamal nodded, but Jake could see the fear in his eyes. "Just keep close," Jake reassured him. "We're almost there." Diesel was riding ahead, taking point as always, his massive form cutting through the darkness. The rest of the bikers stayed in formation, their focus sharp. They had made it this far, but they weren't safe yet. They had to make it to the safe house before the enemy caught up with them. "Stay alert," Jake said, his voice low but commanding. "We'll need to be quick once we reach the house. Get in, lock everything down, and lay low." The bikers nodded in agreement, their expressions hardening with determination. They had no room for error now. As they reached the final stretch, the headlights of an approaching car flickered in the distance. Jake's heart skipped a beat. "Not again," he muttered under his breath. The car was moving fast, and it was heading straight for them. "Get ready," Jake ordered. This could be it. The car sped closer, its headlights blinding in the rear view. Jake's mind raced. It was too soon. They couldn't be caught now. We can't outrun them. Diesel called out from the front, his voice filled with frustration. Jake cursed under his breath. They had to think fast. The safe house was only a mile away, but the car was closing in. There was no way they could outrun it on the open road. Turn off here, Jake shouted, pointing to a side road that veered off the main highway. Diesel didn't hesitate. With a quick swerve, he took the turn, and the rest of the bikers followed suit. The road was narrow, winding through the trees, and the bikes bounced over the uneven terrain. The car behind them followed, its headlights still cutting through the dark. We need to lose them, Jake said, gritting his teeth. The bikes sped down the winding road, the sound of the car's engine growing louder behind them. There's a trail up ahead, Diesel said, pointing to a narrow path that cut through the woods. If we take it, we might be able to lose them. Let's do it, Jake replied. The group veered onto the trail, the bikes bouncing over rocks and debris as they fought to maintain speed. The car's headlights were still visible behind them, but the path was rough, and the car couldn't keep up. Jake could hear the tires skidding, the car struggling to navigate the uneven ground. It's working, Diesel said, glancing back. We've got them. But just as they thought they had escaped, a flash of light pierced the darkness ahead. Jake squinted, his heart dropping as he realized what it was. More cars. Ambush! Jake shouted. The road ahead was blocked by two more vehicles, their headlights blinding as they crept toward the bikers. Jake's heart raced. They were surrounded. There was no way out. We're trapped, Wrench said, his voice filled with urgency. No way through. Stay calm, Jake said, his voice steady despite the growing tension. We fight our way out. Protect Jamal and Aisha. The bikers prepared for the worst. They couldn't let these men take Jamal. They wouldn't let them win. As the first car moved closer, Jake took a deep breath, his hand gripping the handlebar tighter. They would fight. They would fight for their lives, for Jamal, for Aisha. And they would not back down. The bikers skidded to a halt, the sound of their engines roaring in the night as they faced the two cars blocking their path. The headlights were blinding, cutting through the darkness, and the tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Jake's mind raced as he quickly scanned the situation. They were surrounded, with no clear way out. The road behind them was still clear, but the path ahead was blocked. The enemy was closing in, and the group was running out of time. Everyone, stay focused, Jake shouted, his voice commanding despite the chaos. He could see the fear in Aisha's eyes, her small hands clutching him tighter as she pressed against his back. Jamal, too, was silent, his face pale as he looked between the bikers and the approaching vehicles. The moment they had been trying to avoid had finally arrived. They were caught in a trap, with nowhere to run. The men in the cars slowly stepped out, their figures looming in the headlights. Jake's gut tightened. He could feel their cold, calculating presence, and he knew they weren't here to talk. Get Jamal and Aisha to safety, Jake muttered under his breath. We'll hold them off. Diesel, standing beside him, gripped his handlebars, ready for whatever was coming. We've got this, Diesel said, his voice low and steady. We'll make them regret it. The men in the cars took a few steps forward, and Jake could see the weapons they were carrying, guns, knives, and clubs. The bikers were outnumbered, but they weren't going down without a fight. Jake's eyes locked onto the lead figure, a man wearing a black mask and dark clothing. You're not getting away with this, Jake said, his voice full of resolve. The man smirked, his eyes cold and unblinking. You think you can stop us? You're already too late. The air was heavy with tension, and Jake could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. There was no more room for hesitation. The first move had to be theirs. Jake looked to Diesel. Without a word, Diesel nodded and revved his bike, charging forward. The other bikers followed, their engines roaring to life as they moved in formation, cutting off the enemy's advance. The two men with guns took aim, but before they could fire, Diesel swerved, knocking one of the men off balance. The biker with the knife lunged forward, but Jake was faster. He swung his foot out, connecting with the man's chest, sending him crashing to the ground. The sound of the fight echoed in the night as the two groups clashed. Jake moved with precision, his instincts guiding him as he fought to protect the group. He heard a gunshot ring out, the sound deafening in the chaos, but he didn't flinch. He had to stay focused. He couldn't let them take Jamal. As the bikers fought back, The men in the cars regrouped, calling for reinforcements. Jake knew they had to finish this quickly, or they would be overrun. The fight was intense, the air thick with the smell of gasoline and sweat. One of the bikers, Wrench, moved in to help Diesel, tackling one of the men to the ground and pinning him there. Jake caught a glimpse of Aisha, still clinging to the back of his bike, her face full of fear but determined. She trusted him, and he couldn't fail her now. He couldn't fail Jamal either. The battle raged on, but Jake felt a surge of adrenaline as he pushed forward, taking down one of the men who had been trying to flank them. The remaining enemies were retreating, realizing they weren't going to win this fight. But just as Jake thought they had the upper hand, a car screeched to a halt at the far end of the road. A new wave of men had arrived, and they were armed to the teeth. Jake's stomach dropped. They were being surrounded again. "We need to move, now," Jake shouted, his voice urgent. Diesel turned to him, his face a mask of determination. "Get to the bikes. We've got to get out of here." The bikers quickly regrouped, pulling back toward the motorcycles as the sound of approaching vehicles grew louder. "Move, move, move," Jake yelled. The group sprinted toward their bikes, mounting them quickly as they revved their engines. The sound of gunshots rang out behind them, but they didn't stop. They couldn't stop. They had to get away. The bikes tore down the road, the headlights cutting through the night as they raced toward the distant safe house. The men in the cars followed, but the bikers were faster. They swerved through the narrow roads, pushing their bikes to the limit. The trees blurred around them as they moved like shadows, the sound of their engines filling the night air. "We're almost there," Diesel called out, his voice filled with urgency. The safe house was within reach, but Jake couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't out of danger yet. The chase wasn't over. Not by a long shot. But now, they were one step ahead. The bikes roared down the narrow road, the wind whipping past them as they raced toward the safe house. Jake's heart was pounding in his chest, adrenaline coursing through his veins as the familiar feeling of urgency set in. They were almost there, but he knew that the danger wasn't over. The headlights of the cars behind them were still visible in the distance, growing dimmer as they sped through the winding roads. "We're almost there, stay tight," Jake shouted, his voice barely audible over the sound of the engines. Diesel was in the lead, his bike cutting through the night with unmatched speed. The rest of the bikers followed closely, their headlights lighting up the path ahead. The safe house was just up ahead, a small cabin nestled in the woods, isolated from the rest of the world. It was the perfect place to regroup, to rest, and to figure out their next move. But the closer they got, the more Jake felt the weight of the situation. They were being hunted, and they had no idea how long they had before the men in the cars caught up with them. As they neared the cabin, Jake scanned the area. The cabin was dark, its windows boarded up to keep unwanted eyes out. He could feel his pulse quicken, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. This was their last chance, their last refuge. "Keep your eyes peeled," Jake muttered to himself. They couldn't afford any more surprises. Diesel slowed as they reached the cabin, turning off his bike's engine. The others followed suit, the sound of their engines dying down as they came to a stop in the clearing. Jake quickly dismounted, his hand instinctively going to his side where the wound from earlier still stung. He needed to stay focused. They had to move fast. He motioned for the others to follow him as they made their way to the cabin door. Diesel was already at the front, checking the perimeter as the others gathered around. "We've got to lock this place down," Jake said, his voice low. "We don't know how much time we have." They made their way inside, the door creaking as Jake pushed it open. The interior was dimly lit by a single light hanging from the ceiling. Dust and cobwebs lined the corners of the room, but the place was solid, and it would have to do. They weren't here for comfort. They were here to survive. Inside, the bikers quickly started securing the windows, covering any openings that could give away their position. Wrench, the youngest member of the group, was already on his phone, trying to reach some of their other allies. "We need to get word out," Wrench said, his brow furrowed. "We can't stay here forever." Jake nodded in agreement. "We'll stay here for the night, but tomorrow we make our move. We'll get Jamal to safety." Aisha, still holding on to Jamal, sat in a corner, her eyes wide with fear. She hadn't spoken much since the attack, but Jake could see the exhaustion on her face. She had been through so much, and he knew she was trying to keep it together for Jamal. He walked over to her, kneeling down in front of the two kids. "You're safe now," Jake said, trying to reassure her. "We're not letting anyone hurt you." Aisha nodded, but her eyes didn't leave Jamal's. The boy was still silent, his gaze distant as if he was lost in thought. Jake couldn't imagine what he had been through, but he knew one thing for sure. He wouldn't let anyone take Jamal from them. The door creaked as one of the bikers, Shadow, walked over. "We've got company," he said, his voice tense. Jake's heart skipped a beat. He motioned for everyone to be quiet as he moved toward the window. He peered through the cracks in the boarded-up wood, his eyes scanning the area. In the distance, he could see headlights. They were close. Too close. "Damn it," Jake muttered under his breath. "They're here." The sound of an engine revving in the distance was the first sign that the enemy had found them. The bikers quickly took positions around the cabin, preparing for whatever was coming. Jake's mind raced as he thought about their options. The safe house wasn't going to hold forever. They had to fight, or they had to run. The headlights grew brighter as the vehicles approached, the sound of tires on gravel growing louder. The men had tracked them down, and now they were here for one thing, Jamal. Jake gritted his teeth. He wasn't going to let them take him. "We fight," Jake said, his voice calm but firm. Diesel nodded, his face hardening. "We've got this." The bikers positioned themselves, ready for whatever came next. Jake kept his focus on the door, listening to the approaching vehicles. The tension was unbearable. They had one chance to get this right. The door suddenly burst open, and the first man stepped inside. The air was thick with the scent of gasoline and sweat as the two groups faced off. Jake's heart was racing, but he stood his ground. He wasn't going to let them take another step. This was their stand. The bikers were ready, and the fight was about to begin. The door slammed open with a deafening crash as the first man barged into the cabin, his weapon drawn, eyes scanning the room with a cold, calculated look. Behind him, more men followed, their footsteps heavy as they entered, filling the small, dimly lit cabin. The tension in the room was unbearable. Jake's heart was pounding, his mind racing as the men took position. They had come for one thing, and Jake wasn't going to let them have it. The group of bikers stood firm, their eyes locked on the intruders. Diesel was the first to react, stepping forward, his massive frame blocking the path between the men and the others. "You've come for the boy," Diesel said, his voice low and menacing. The leader of the group, a man with a scar running across his cheek, stepped forward with a smirk. "You're too late," the man said. "We've got what we came for." Jake didn't flinch. "You're not taking him," Jake said firmly, his voice unwavering. The scarred man chuckled, glancing at the others. "You think you can stop us? We've been tracking you for miles." He motioned to his men. "Take them down." Without warning, one of the men lunged at Diesel, swinging a blunt object toward his head. Diesel blocked the attack with his arm, the force of the blow reverberating through his body, but he remained standing, his face hard with determination. The fight was on. Jake moved quickly, his body moving on instinct as he grabbed a nearby metal pipe. With a swift motion, he swung it at the closest man, knocking him off balance. The man stumbled back, his gun slipping from his grip as Jake followed through with another blow, sending him crashing to the ground. The room erupted into chaos. The sound of fists colliding, grunts of pain, and the clash of metal filled the air as the bikers fought back with everything they had. Wrench, small but quick, darted past the attackers, using his agility to his advantage. He moved with precision, knocking a gun out of one of the men's hands before delivering a crushing blow to his stomach. "We don't have much time," Wrench shouted, his voice filled with urgency as he moved toward the back of the cabin, where Aisha and Jamal were hiding. Aisha, her small form trembling with fear, had her arms wrapped around Jamal, trying to shield him from the violence unfolding around them. Jamal, though frightened, remained silent, his eyes wide with fear but trusting in the bikers who had promised to protect him. "Stay down," Jake shouted to Aisha. "We've got this." Jake's eyes locked onto the scarred man, who was now advancing toward him, a knife in his hand. The man's eyes gleamed with malice as he closed the distance. "You should have stayed out of this," the man spat, lunging forward with the knife aimed straight for Jake. But Jake was faster. With a swift motion, he sidestepped, grabbing the man's arm and twisting it behind his back. The knife fell to the ground with a clatter, but the man didn't give up. He tried to break free, but Jake's grip was ironclad. "It's over," Jake said, his voice cold as he slammed the man into the ground. The man groaned in pain, but he didn't fight back. Jake kept him pinned, making sure he couldn't get up. "Move!" Jake shouted to the others. "We need to get out of here." The rest of the bikers, having dispatched their attackers, moved quickly to help the others. Diesel was helping Wrench get to the back of the cabin, while Shadow kept watch by the door, his eyes scanning the perimeter. "We're not done yet," Shadow said, his voice tight with concern. "They won't stop until they get him." Jake nodded, his eyes hardening. "We need to move fast. Grab Jamal and Aisha. We're leaving." The bikers quickly made their way to the back of the cabin, where Aisha and Jamal were still huddled together. Aisha looked up at Jake with a mixture of relief and fear in her eyes. "Is it safe?" she asked, her voice trembling. Jake nodded, though. He could see the uncertainty in her gaze. "For now, yes. But we need to move. Now." The group gathered around, and with a swift motion, they all moved toward the door. Jake led the way, keeping a steady pace as they made their way back to the bikes. The men in the cars were still out there, and they weren't done with the bikers. But Jake wasn't about to let them win. They had to get Jamal to safety, and they couldn't waste another second. As they mounted their bikes, Jake glanced at the cabin one last time. The lights from the enemy vehicles were already visible in the distance. They had no more time to waste. With one final look toward Aisha and Jamal, Jake kicked the bike into gear. The rest of the bikers followed suit, the engines roaring as they sped down the road, leaving the danger of the cabin behind. The chase was still on, but Jake was determined. They weren't giving up now. The engines roared as the group of bikers tore down the road, the wind rushing past them. Jake's mind was racing, but his focus never wavered. The danger was still very real. They had just barely escaped the cabin, and now they were heading into unknown territory. The headlights of the enemy vehicles were still visible in the distance, but Jake pushed the throttle harder, urging his bike to go faster. "We need to put more distance between us and them," Jake muttered, eyes scanning the rearview mirror. The headlights of the cars were still there, tailing them closely. "We're not out of the woods yet," Diesel said, glancing back briefly. "We need to take a different route." "Agreed," Jake said. They had to stay one step ahead, or they would be caught. The group veered off the main road, taking a narrow side street that wound through dense trees. The path was bumpy, but it was their best chance at losing their pursuers. The bikers skillfully navigated the winding trail, the trees blurring past them as they maneuvered through the thick foliage. The sounds of the cars following them were now distant, but Jake didn't trust that they had lost them. Not yet. The group pressed on, the bike engines vibrating beneath them as they pushed the machines to their limits. "We need to find a place to lay low," Jake said, his voice strained but calm. "Somewhere remote." "There's a farmstead up ahead," Wrench called out from behind. "It's isolated. We could take shelter there." Jake nodded. "Lead the way." They made their way toward the farmstead, the path growing rougher as the trees became denser. The sound of the enemy vehicles faded, but Jake knew they couldn't be sure they were safe until they were hidden. Finally, they arrived at the farmstead. The old wooden house stood in the distance, barely visible through the overgrown trees. The place was abandoned, just like the safe house earlier. It was perfect for what they needed. Jake slowed down, giving the signal for the group to halt. The bikers pulled their bikes to the side of the dilapidated building, their engines dying as they came to a stop. They quickly dismounted, checking their surroundings. The area was eerily quiet, with nothing but the rustling of leaves in the wind. It was the perfect place to regroup. "We'll stay here for the night," Jake said. "Keep watch. We need to be ready." The group spread out, taking positions around the house and the surrounding yard. Diesel stood near the door, while Shadow kept a lookout from the back. Wrench checked the windows and the perimeter. Jake glanced at Aisha, who was sitting with Jamal on one of the bikes, her small hands gripping the boy tightly. "You're safe here," Jake reassured her. "We'll make sure they don't find us." Aisha nodded, though her face was still full of fear. Jamal was still silent, his gaze distant, as if he was lost in his thoughts. Jake couldn't imagine what the boy had gone through, but he could see the fear and exhaustion in his eyes. He had to protect him, no matter what. "We'll make sure you're safe," Jake promised, his voice firm. "No one is taking you from us." The sound of the wind howling through the trees was the only noise in the otherwise still night. The group settled in, preparing for what was to come. They had a moment of respite, but Jake knew it wouldn't last long. The men who were after Jamal weren't just going to give up. They were ruthless, and they would stop at nothing to get what they wanted. The next few hours felt like an eternity as the group stayed on high alert, keeping a close eye on every movement, every sound. But as the night wore on, the silence remained, and Jake allowed himself to relax, just for a moment. They had made it this far, and they could make it through the night. The danger was still out there, but for now, they were safe. The first rays of light began to break through the trees, signaling the start of a new day. Jake stood up, his muscles stiff from the tension of the night. "We move at first light," he said, his voice low but filled with determination. "We don't stop until we get Jamal to safety." Diesel, standing nearby, gave him a nod of agreement. The rest of the group gathered their gear and prepared to leave. They couldn't stay here for long. Jake looked over at Aisha and Jamal one last time. Aisha's grip on Jamal's hand was tight, and the boy's eyes were full of fear. But they had made it this far, and they weren't going to stop now. "We'll get you to safety," Jake said, his voice filled with a promise that he would keep. The bikers mounted their bikes and revved their engines, ready for whatever came next. The road ahead was uncertain, but Jake knew that with the group by his side, they would make it through. They had fought hard to get this far, and they weren't about to give up now. With one last look at the farmstead, Jake kicked the bike into gear and sped off into the distance, the rest of the bikers following close behind. The bikers sped down the open highway, their engines roaring in unison as they raced toward the unknown. The night was still, but the weight of what lay ahead was heavy in the air. Jake's hands gripped the handlebars tightly, his mind focused on the road ahead, but his thoughts were with Jamal and Aisha. They had fought through so much to get this far, and now they were closer to safety. The enemy was still out there, hunting them down, but Jake was determined. He would not let them take another step. The road stretched before them, endless and dark, but they were almost there. The safe house was just ahead. They had to make it through one last stretch, but the promise of safety was close enough to taste. The sun was beginning to rise, painting the sky with shades of orange and pink, signaling the end of a long, dangerous night. But Jake knew the fight wasn't over. The enemy was relentless. They had tracked him and the group for miles, and he didn't trust that they would give up. They had to keep moving, stay one step ahead, and never look back. As they neared the turnoff for the safe house, Jake glanced over his shoulder. The headlights of the enemy's vehicles were still visible in the distance, but they were falling behind. It wasn't enough to stop them yet. He pushed the throttle harder, urging the bike forward. His crew followed closely behind, their bikes moving like a well-oiled machine. They couldn't let their guard down. The safe house was in sight, just a few miles away. But Jake's instincts were on high alert. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. They had to make it there first. The group reached the turn, the familiar dirt road leading to the safe house coming into view. Jake's eyes scanned the horizon. There were no cars in sight, no signs of anyone following. For the first time in hours, he allowed himself to breathe a little easier. "We're almost there," Jake said, his voice low but filled with relief. The group moved steadily toward the house, their bikes kicking up dust as they made their way down the long, winding road. The house stood in the distance, its weathered walls barely visible through the trees. It was secluded, tucked away from prying eyes. This was the place they had fought for, and now it was within reach. But just as they approached the house, the sound of tires screeching to a halt broke the silence. Jake's heart stopped. The enemy had found them again. A black SUV appeared at the end of the road, its headlights cutting through the trees. The same group of men from the cabin, their faces twisted with rage. Jake's pulse quickened as he signaled for the group to stop. They were out of time. "Get ready," Jake shouted. "This isn't over yet." The bikers quickly took their positions, their bikes lined up as they prepared for the final showdown. The men in the SUV stepped out, their guns drawn, ready to finish what they had started. "You thought you could get away?" The scarred man from before sneered, his voice cold and threatening. "You're not leaving here with the boy." Jake stepped forward, his eyes locked onto the man. "You're not taking him," Jake said, his voice calm but filled with fury. The scarred man smirked, his grip tightening on the weapon in his hand. "We'll see about that." The tension in the air was palpable. Jake could hear the sound of his heartbeat in his ears as he prepared for the worst. He had no choice but to fight. They had come this far, and they wouldn't stop now. The bikers moved swiftly, circling the men, ready for anything. The first shot rang out, echoing in the still morning air, but it missed its mark. The battle began in a blur of movement, fists connecting, guns firing, and bodies moving with precision. Jake ducked behind a nearby tree as the gunfire intensified, his heart racing. He could see Diesel and Wrench taking down the enemy one by one, their speed and strength overwhelming the attackers. But the scarred man was still there, moving toward Jamal. Jake's heart skipped a beat as he saw the man reach for the boy. Without thinking, Jake charged forward, his muscles burning as he sprinted toward the man. "Get away from him!" Jake shouted as he tackled the scarred man to the ground, knocking the gun out of his hand. The two men struggled, but Jake's determination was unmatched. He wasn't going to let anyone take Jamal. With a final, powerful shove, Jake threw the man off, sending him crashing into the dirt. The scarred man groaned in pain, but didn't move. Jake stood over him, his chest heaving with exertion. "Stay down," Jake said, his voice steady but cold. As the last of the enemy was subdued, the bikers regrouped, their faces hardened with resolve. "It's over," Diesel said, his voice heavy with relief. "We did it." Jake looked over at Aisha and Jamal, who were standing by the bikes, their eyes wide with fear but filled with hope. They were safe. For now. The group made their way to the house, their bodies exhausted but their spirits lifted. They had won. They had kept their promise. Jamal was safe, and they had one last chance to breathe, to rest, and to regroup. Jake looked out at the horizon, knowing that their fight was over, for now, but ready for whatever came next. He had promised to protect them, and he had kept his word. In this thrilling tale of courage and loyalty, immerse yourself in one of the most gripping Hell Angels stories where a group of bikers fights to protect a young boy from ruthless enemies. When a young girl warns a biker that a child has been dragged into a restricted chamber, the bikers spring into action, diving headfirst into a world of danger, betrayal, and relentless pursuit. With every turn, the bikers face life-threatening situations, but their bond of brotherhood and the promise made to a fallen friend keeps them moving forward. From high-speed chases through deserted highways to intense battles in abandoned safehouses, these Hell Angels stories demonstrate the lengths to which one will go to protect those they love. With the odds stacked against them, the bikers navigate treacherous terrain and face overwhelming opposition, but their determination never wavers. As they fight back against those who would harm the innocent, these Hell Angel stories highlight their fierce loyalty and undying courage. The stakes are high, but with each victory, they come one step closer to keeping their promise. In the end, these Hell Angel stories deliver a satisfying conclusion where the biker's struggle leads to safety, but the journey is far from over. Follow the adventure, filled with intense action and heart-pounding moments, and witness how the biker crew fights for the future of the young boy caught in a world of violence and danger. Don't miss this incredible ride through one of the most intense Hell Angels stories you've ever experienced.